the fun part about Torsten is if you invite him to pick a topic to lecture on, it's always something surprising. He's talked about nitrous oxide, I think, about comparative natural states to states induced by psychoactive substances. And today he'll give a lecture about the history of psychedelic research over the last 100 years, as far as I can tell. So waves of psychedelic research from the 1920s till the present. So your attention please for Torsten for the next 50 minutes, after which we'll close the conference. Well, that's it basically. Please give a hand to Torsten.
So thank you very much, Joost, for that nice introduction. I want to make an excuse before I start because the optics are not very good here. The visuals are not very good here. And so, but however, so what I want to do is I will give you a kind of tour de force through the last century of psychedelic research, but with pronunciation on from the 70s to the present. So, okay, I give you a short overview of the lecture, which is I will give you this overview in decades, and I will give you a few locations where research happened and happens right now. And I will give you some ideas about some not so well-known organizations which have played a role in the whole thing and their activities. And I will give you a synopsis from, how we'll see what it will be. So, okay, about the decades. It started in the 20s. I will give you only a very short outline of that. So it was about mescaline, which started in 1900, in fact, a little earlier, mainly in Germany. It was Louis Levine, who is a very prominent guy. His book was named Fantastica, and it's also translated in some languages. And there was Arthur Heffter, a professor of pharmacology at the University of Leipzig. And he was the one who found out about the active ingredient of mescaline by doing self-trials with different extracts. And this is why he was honored, and he was a universal scholar in pharmacology, and this is why he was honored by giving the name to the Heffter Research Institute, which still survives and which is doing all these psilocybin studies. And there was Kurt Behringer, a very prominent psychiatrist, anyway, beyond his research on mescaline, but he published a very big monograph about the experiences of 50 experimental subjects and artists and so on. He has given mescaline too, but he was hooked up with a psychopathological model. And there was Wagner, just to mention that, the first guy who studied comprehensively the peyote cult in Mexico and America. And there was Friedrich's recently discovered dissertation on the mescaline inhibition and its psychological features, which is very, very comprehensive. And that was really a discovery. There was only one exemplar of that dissertation left. It was started in 1935. And now we're, interestingly, during the period when the fascists were in power in Europe, there was virtually no research going on. So we are back in the 1950s with the first studies at the Zurich University Clinic, where they still do hallucinogen research today, conducted by Stoll and Kondrau, so the first clinical trials with these substances. Stoll was doing the very first research with LSD, and Kondrau was giving LSD to schizophrenics. Then in 1953, Bush and Johnson, some Jungian psychotherapists, had published the first idea to use it in psychoanalytic ways and to help psychoanalytic therapy. And they were successful, and this was taken on by Sandoz, who developed LSD to popularize LSD as a potential adjunct to psychotherapy in a psychoanalytic framework. And then at the same point of time, the basic research was started, and it was very much triggered because before the 1950s, we had no idea about how these mental disorders, especially psychosis, are caused in the brain. So we had just very rough hypothesis, but then we found out about neurotransmitters, and that was triggered very much by LSD, because there we have a substance which is giving a lot of psychotomimetic effects in a very minuscule amount. And in 1955, Leuna started his research and his therapeutic work, as well as Sanderson in the UK. And then they had conferences, 1955, on serotonin and LSD, and the others were about therapeutic use. And the research on hallucinogens was present at every major conference on pharmacology and neuropsychopharmacology at that point of time during the 50s and 60s. Here is a picture of some of the pioneers, two of the pioneers, Ernst Jünger, a writer, a very prominent writer, and Albert Hofmann. They took experimentally LSD together for kind of spiritual exploration into inner space during the early 50s, and this continued into the 60s, and they both wrote books about their experiences. And then the military showed up. So there were originally there was some research at Auschwitz and another concentration camp where they have injected people with mescaline to lose their tongues. Means spies and other people, they want to get extract some stuff in interrogation procedures out of them. And so this research was in fact followed up, as well as the rocket science. As you may know, they have got that from the Germans, which have developed that further. And so the US secret services were very much aware of what happened in the concentration camps in relation to that, and they developed their own approach to use it. So LSD was used, in fact, in interrogation procedures, even in Europe, by US personnel. And this research mainly stopped when they have given a lot of psychoactive substances at New York Psychiatric State Institute in a more or less official manner. They gave unknown drugs, not tested in animals, to patients without their knowledge, with the background of military contracts. And what happened is people there, the psychiatrists, didn't know what they are doing. One of them was stating later that we didn't know if it was dog piss or not. You know, so they really don't know what they were giving, and they gave a patient a kind of overdose of MDA, and that patient died. Afterwards, it was the psychiatrist told the militaries, we can't do this research anymore because if you don't have animal data, we will not conduct any studies anymore. So they were going on to test some mescaline derivatives at the University of Michigan, but that was an interesting but a different story. So Edgewood Arsenal in the US, as well as Porton Down in the UK, were these locations where the military tested these compounds. And a central idea behind that was that we may have a weapon at hand which we can use to have war without death. You know, we confuse the people. We build a bomb which will explode above the city, and then it will go down like an aerosol, and you will ingest it by breathing, and then you will be completely confused, right? That was the idea behind it. So in a way, excuse me, but a kind of humanistic ideas for the militaries, right? Okay. So they really explored that. But what they found out is it is a useless weapon because their conclusion was it is like having a gun which is firing different caliber shells in different directions, not under your control. So what do you want with that kind of substance? So the only thing what was left was a kind of undercover use, like, for example, if you would put some LSD into a drinking water tank on a, what is it, where a kind of boat where they have airplanes on? I don't aircraft carrier? Yeah, right. If you would put it in their water supply, that could work, that they got kind of irritated and they're on the sea, so if they die for whatever reason or shoot each other, you don't. But mostly, by the way, the soldiers were only laughing. Yeah, some climbed up the trees to speak with the birds and stuff like that. So they were not really doing bad stuff to each other. But you don't know if they think, oh, that red button is interesting, let's push it. Kind of that. So they lost that. So what they came up with at last, by their conclusion, is they made a kind of what is it called, a nightshade, alkaloids from the nightshade family. They are still in stock to be used as weapons because they give you a totally confused delirious state. Okay, what's happened? You know what happened in the 1960s and the later 60s. It was, in fact, a decade of basic research. A lot was published. We have from biochemistry to art to therapy. It was a lot going on. They had multiple conferences during the 1960s. There were more than 8,000 publications on LSD and other psychedelics, so it was really a blooming research landscape. And there was also the European Society for Psycholytic Therapy, founded by Leuner, who gathered all the psycholytic therapists together in certain meetings. And then the misuse showed up. In fact, it began in the early 60s in Los Angeles when some therapists leaked it out to patients and other friends. And then it was made illegal, as you know, and the clinical research ended completely or nearly completely. So I will give you some pictures. They are not that good. I made that exclusion already. So this is Ronald Sanderson from the UK. This is Hans-Karl Leuner from Germany. And this is Walter Pankey from that team where they follow up the research right now at Hopkins. And this is a very prominent figure in the 1960s, not much well known today. It is Sidney Cohen. I'm a fan of him, to admit that, because he has also done the first studies in volunteers comparing placebo, amphetamine, and LSD in appropriate settings, appropriate conditions, appropriate dosage, and he really found these personality changes, which we are hanging up right now, too. And there was Stanislav Grof for sure, who came from Czechoslovakia originally and changed to the US and wrote all these fantastic books. And then there was the Psychedelic Review, the first journal devoted to psychedelic drugs. It appeared the first time in the beginning of the 60s. Here you see titled Expectation, Mood, and Psilocybin. So they have seen these kind of after effects at that point of time already. And here are some prominent figures from the 1960s. This is Allen Ginsberg and a very rare photograph with Timothy Leary together. And you know what happened then. But there was a very, very potent conference on the ethnopharmacological search for psychoactive drugs. A very potent conference, readable, and I recommend reading even today, which was organized by one of the major figures of psychopharmacology in general in the 1960s, which was Daniel Efron. And after this conference, you know what happened with the hippies and all these escalating drug use. But mainly, you have to remember that it escalated mainly in the US, nowhere else. So, but their suppression was fundamental afterwards. So we are now in the 1970s. So Coulan's group at Spring Grove, later the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, Grove and Jensen did a study on MDA in psychoneurotic outpatients, and Richards conducted the last government-financed study on using DPT in terminal cancer patients. Then only a very few researchers were left during the 70s, which was Claudio Naranjo in Chile, because he had a kind of special permit to do it there, and he cooperated with Shulgin on new substances. He also used yagé or ayahuasca very early on. And there was Salvador Roque in Mexico. He also had a special kind of permit at the Albert Schweitzer Institute in Mexico City. He conducted still psychedelic or psycholytic sessions there in a very unusual kind of environment what he created. And there was Milan Hausner in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, who has done LSD therapy for more than 20 years. And he was a very prominent figure in psychotherapy and psychosomatics in Czechoslovakia. And he was able to conduct his therapeutic work until the end of the 70s. And there was Jan Bastiaans in Leiden in the Netherlands, who has mainly done therapeutic work with concentration camp survivors. And it's very impressive if you ever have the chance to look up such a film with these treatments. It's very impressive. I don't know, I heard here that there is a kind of certain bad reputation about him, but I don't know exactly what happens. And Leuner, to mention him again, was doing his work without any questioning in Germany throughout the 70s. And there was, this is virtually unknown, there was Fesslinger, the head physician of a psychotherapeutic clinic, as well as Gnurs, a psychiatrist, and Baker at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute in Switzerland. They are all in Switzerland located. They have also conducted their therapeutic work throughout the 70s, but without much public attention. There was virtually none. And there was also in the US a very interesting experimental researcher, which I also recommend to study, Roland Fisher, and there was David Nichols, there was Richard Glennon, but they mainly did research in animal and in vitro assays. Then I have to mention the early starts of Adolf Dittrich, who designed the questionnaire, which is still used today. And he began with his studies in altered states of consciousness, including drugs, in 1972. At Zurich University Psychiatric Clinic. In the 1980s, Leuner was still active, doing LSD, psilocybin, 2,4-D, and ketamine in patient work. And Dittrich was going more into his studies using laughing gas, THC, DMT, and psilocybin, as well as stimuli overload and sensory deprivation to compare all these states and develop the 5D APZ questionnaire, which is still in use today. So some terminal patients, as far as I was informed, were still done under a special permit in the US by the parts of the former Spring Grove team. And there was kind of a little underground work was going on very secretly, and their kind of meeting point was where Grove was also a scholar in residence, which was the Esalen Institute, a major point of or a major institution of the human potential movement in the 1960s onwards. They have done they were the kind of meeting point of the underground network, which was calling itself the Arupa. So, which is kind of in Buddhism, as far as I heard, it has a meaning of being invisible. And that was how it was. I will come later again to that. So Downing, John Downing, in connection with a very early organization, the Earth Metabolic Design Laboratories, mainly done by Rick Doblin and two cooperators, they were organizing an MDMA study in a very freestyle kind of setting at a private house, but with having a lot of subjects and where they controlled for physiological parameter, even doing blood pickings and so on, so that there were some initial data before the DEA will schedule the substance and the research will be shut down. And also a significant development was the dispersion of the underground therapeutic work was already done in the US, but it came to Europe. I was part of that scenery in 1985 when Rolf Metzner conducted his first workshop under legal condition in Germany, and a lot of people attending these workshops were very much inspired and were going on with the psychotherapeutic use of MDMA in Europe. Also, in the mid-60s, two special institutions or organizations were founded, which was the Swiss Physicans Society for Psycholytic Therapy. I will later come back to that. It still exists today and was very active. And the European College for the Study of Consciousness. in German ECBS is the abbreviation. They were both founded in 1985 with the intent to do and to conduct and to support research and to exchange experiences about these fields and their conceptualization. And also MAPS was founded during these years, and some early research proposals were introduced to the FDA and other institutions to do research with MDMA in humans, but all this was stopped because of some neurotoxicity ideas which were actual at that point of time, and so the FDA was hesitating to give any permission for any research until 1992. But Rick Doblin was quite active, so he organized from private resources of money an animal study, which some people don't like, this kind of stuff, so he had to do it on his own, but he realized that, and this is still the base of the FDA master file about MDMA and its toxicology and animal physiology studies. So his endeavor is still based on that, what he reached at that point of time, which was kind of unreachable, but Rick is good for that. So interestingly, there was a kind of a tiny story about a research project going on in Germany. It was when at Freiburg University, two potent researchers named Leo Hermle and Manfred Spitzer were present when some pharmacology professor at the university had to clean up his office because he was retired. And then he showed up and told them, "Oh, I have a little brown glass here. It contains a white substance. It's called mescaline. It's pretty interesting, but nobody has done research on it." And in fact, it was a mescaline left from Behringer. He changed from Heidelberg, where he originally conducted his mescaline research, to Freiburg University. And so they brought that to the laboratory. It was 100% pure still. And so they conducted some research with mescaline and even have done a SPECT study in 1988. But I will come later back to that a little. Then the SAEPT reached an unreachable goal, so they got permission for 5 psychiatrists, psychotherapists to do psycholytic work in their offices in a very kind of unlimited fashion. As Grove told me, they had a carte blanche, but they lost this permission. I'll give you some details later on. And in Germany, coming from the research done on mescaline at first, this research group changed to the study of MDE, which is a close relative of MDMA, and they also started a project with psilocybin in 1990. So the 1980s were impregnated by this guy, right? Which is Ronald Reagan, and he declared the war on drug, and he really suppressed everything. We had so much paranoia when we were traveling in the US at that point of time. It was unbelievable. It was really bad. So, however, so this is Zurich Psychiatric University Clinic from above, where this pioneering research happened, even throughout the 70s and 80s. So, and this guy is Adolf Dittrich, the only picture you can get of him. And this is his professorship thesis, looking out for if he can measure kind of universal dimensions in different kinds of altered states. I will come later back to that. So here we have an outlook from the Azarian Institute, just to give you some pictures. People like that. So, and this is a first comprehensive book on MDMA done by Richard Seymour from the Hayes-Ashbury Medical Clinic in San Francisco. He put it all, a lot of effort together and a lot of material to give people a clearer picture of what is known about MDMA in 1985. And this is Leuner again at an ECBS Congress. And this is Albert Hofmann. These guys founded the ECBS, the European College for the Study of Consciousness. And just to give you an idea that nothing happened during the 80s. So this was the only scientific book on hallucinogenic drugs which appeared during the 1980s. It's crazy. And we had some underground journals, but a very few, you can't get hold of them. The psychedelic monographs and essays was one where we could publish some more freestyle stuff, which is one not completely scientific, but partially it was scientific. And the revision journal, partially edited by Grove, has done a special issue on psychedelics revisited in 1988. It also contained the first comprehensive guide how to use MDMA and psychotherapeutic frameworks by Ralph Metzner, and a pseudo co-author, a pseudonym, where he published it with. And this is Leo Hermle, who has conducted the first SAEPT study with mescaline here in action. And now we leave the 1980s. Not completely. I'll give you a short idea what Dittrich has found out with his research, doing different induction maneuvers and inducing different altered states of consciousness and trying to measure them with questionnaires. And so what he found at last, the most elaborative construct of Dittrich is a 5D, 5 dimensions, APZ, which means extraordinary psychological states. And he found 5 dimensions, which is oceanic boundlessness, dread of ego dissolution. I allow myself a remark here, because it seems that some researchers misunderstand that this oceanic boundlessness, it's an ego dissolution too, but this is a positive variant of it. And dread of ego dissolution, it was shown on some slides that this is a measure for ego dissolution. No, this is a measure for the negative ego dissolution. So we have to realize that we have 2 measures of ego dissolution, right? So these are the 2 components of the ego dissolution. Then you have visuals coming up with most of these conditions, and also sometimes a reduction of vigilance. For example, in sensory deprivation tanks, the people sometimes fell asleep, right? And some of the state is caused by lowering the wakefulness. And they were also finding auditory alterations known from ayahuasca and from DMT injection. And so these are the 5 dimensions which he found out and which are still used to measure these altered states on a kind of subjective level. Interestingly, at a symposium, he gave me the information, or he told to some people that this is originally the Huxley concept, heaven, hell, and visions. Okay? However, so here is a picture giving you an idea about an oceanic boundlessness state. I hope it's kind of appropriate as it can be. And this is a dread of ego dissolution picture, something quite different. And this kind of visual restructuralization, it's much more concrete than you think from that term, right? So I only don't want to go too much into this, but this is a pattern you can find with different substances. For example, here's laughing gas from our data, what we generated, and here you see that is a vigilance reduction thing here. So it's very high compared to these things, like, for example, this is LSD, this is MDMA, this is amphetamine, and the left button is oceanic boundlessness. Then you find dread of ego dissolution, which is less with MDMA for sure, and this is the same, the most visual restructuralization you will find with that substance, and here you have some different patterns, and so you can compare these states or differentiate between the states. It is mainly important from my point of view that you can characterize if an hallucinogenic drug is reducing your vigilance, it's also reducing consciousness or doing a clouding of consciousness, which may be not favorable for therapeutic processing. Okay, during the 1990s, what's happened? Due to the blocking of a lot of research, not only in respect to hallucinogenic drugs, but because in relation to other drugs too, the FDA inside the institution made some changes, and they installed the so-called pilot drug evaluation stuff, so that they evaluate drugs very quickly if they can bring a new development or not, and how they can be processed through the approval process and through the experimental trials. And so they want to make the process more effective. And in relation to that, partially thanks to Rick Doblin again, they made a conference of the NIDA researchers, also with FDA members as presenters, which is called Hallucinogens and Update. And there they put together all the information which was known at that point of time. And also at that conference, it was talked about a group's study with MDMA in volunteers, because they implemented a protocol, or they submitted a protocol about treating terminal cancer patients with MDMA, but after their sober evaluation in the pilot drug evaluation stuff, the FDA said, okay, it's not early enough, it's too early to go into patients, so you have to go into volunteers first. But they gave permission for that study, right? And also there was research going on in Tübingen with psilocybin and in Freiburg with MDE. And Vollenweider at that point during the mid-90s has started with his research on neuroimaging and psychometric evaluation of ketamine, psilocybin and MDMA, which was pioneering at that point of time. And MAPS and Heffter have to be mentioned because they supported these activities very much. There was also Vanya Palmas, it has to be mentioned here, a millionaire from Switzerland who has very much sponsored the research, especially of Vollenweider's group. Then there was Rick Strassman, who has done a study, as you may know, on intravenous DMT, which was the first study with a classical hallucinogen permitted in the US in 1992. The ECBS holds some congresses during the 90s, which were very comprehensive in these years. And there was a remarkable conference. We had a conference, should I say, we had a conference in San Francisco about the 50 years of LSD thing, which was quite a different happening. But the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences made a very special event, which was very prominently published at last. They put it together, the major hallucinogen researchers worldwide, for a conference named 50 Years of LSD, and it happened in Basel. And there was, not much known, Persinger, Michael Persinger, who has done a lot of studies into the neurobiological of religion, as he calls it. He has done a study with magnetism. So he put people in a dark room, and they sat in the middle on a seat, and then he had a machinery which is going on this way around them, having a magnet on it. And so he want to look if they, in complete darkness, if they could detect if there is a magnet in the apparatus or not. And they could detect it. They had kind of light kind of visions. Pretty interesting, but this study is not much known, but it has to be mentioned because there was no LSD study around at that point. So, and there was the outcome of the Freiburg group was there was a comparative PET study, to my eyes, the best study ever done, because it compared in the same people different substances under the same, exactly the same setting conditions, right? And they compared methamphetamine, psilocybin, and MDE in the mid-90s, and it was very important insofar as we could characterize the entectogenic neurobiological profile of MDMA and related substances as MDE. And MAPS started the phase 2 trials in the late 1990s with Michael Mithoefer's studies after gone through such a lot of hurdles that nobody would survive that, usually. You know who survived that. I just want to give you a few pictures from that research. So this is a placebo condition, and here you can see MDE, and what is pretty interesting, maybe, oh yeah, you can see it. So here you see the area where the left amygdala is located, so the center of the brain sphere network, and here on the other side you see MDE deactivates the amygdala in the left hemisphere. This was proven with MDMA too, and this is, to my eyes, the central effect was what MDMA is doing to the functional architecture of the brain. And interestingly enough, if you compare this to other drugs like methamphetamine, you see your metabolism is going down in the brain because this is measuring glucose metabolism, so the factual metabolism, not blood flow, metabolism. And you see why methamphetamine users only tell you dully stuff and are not empathic anymore, because their brain is kind of deactivated, in fact. You know, all the major structures are deactivated. How is that? And here is another picture of psilocybin, and here you can see in that area is a certain activation was found. Now the results are kind of confusing because the London group found different results in relation to blood flow, but metabolic activity may be a different thing, who knows. However, these were the findings of that study. So just to mention foreign virus studies and some pictures. So here you see, sorry for the thing, you usually can do that, see that better. But he also made these PET studies under virtually identical conditions. And this is the resting state. And here you see the red colors are the more activated areas of the brain. And here you see mainly the cingulum and some paralimbic structures are activated as well as the frontal cortex. And one interesting study was done by Spitzer in an experiment about psilocybin. I took part in this experiment as an experimental subject and learned a lot because the researchers in the 90s, they put a lot of experiments into the time frame. So we had to do this and this and this, and then we had to pee in a specific kind of glass. Then we had to get blood picked and everything for the pharmacokinetic studies. Then you had to go back to the computer again. You know, so I learned, don't do it that way. And I really, my study was 45 minutes of neuropsychology and some other stuff, and all the rest of the time you will be comfortable and in a good environment with an agreeable atmosphere. That was completely different with their thing. They had one subject going psychotic. I don't wonder. However, we conducted a very interesting experiment there with a new paradigm at that point of time. To put it simply, it was about associations. So usually, if I would ask you to give me your association about a specific word like cognition or sex or whatever, then you will have a certain frame where you will answer in. So the usual person will give you a frame of words which is well known because we have tested 100, right? So this is what is in the circle, right? And if you give a person psilocybin, this pattern of associations, there will be no more associations, there may be even some less, but the scope will be broadened, and even broader if the substance is really active. So some people took that as a kind of evidence for furthering of creativity or making up the mind for some new thoughts or associations. That was an interesting study. Okay, we are back now in the chronicle. So Roland Griffiths started his research in the late 1990s, but it really was conducted in the 2000s with psilocybin and mystical experience at first. I have done my studies with psilocybin, ketamine, laughing gas, THC, MDMA, and Vornweiser has conducted diverse, that's right, not right. So Vornweiser had conducted a lot of studies with psilocybin, neuroimaging studies, psychrometric studies, some studies with paradigms used to evaluate mental disorders and so on, a really comprehensive research program. And Charlie Grob started his therapeutic program with doing psilocybin in terminal cancer patients. And the MAPS research program with MDMA was started. Mithoefer conducted a study, Oehn in Switzerland, and Gasser's LSD study was also supported very much by MAPS, and he finished that study with patients having existential anxiety from terminal cancer. And there were some studies in Spain and in the Netherlands on ayahuasca as well on MDMA, which Jordi have conducted mainly, and some other guys, and in the Dutch they mainly research neuropsychological functioning in relation, for example, in relation to driving performance, for example. And this is my lab at Hanover Medical School, so it was quite an appropriate environment. I was very lucky because by chance, I got the best environment in the university because it was a former room for music therapy, and they had no use because there was no music therapist there. So I occupied that kind of lab and conducted my studies there in a very agreeable environment. And I will give you a short note about one significant experiment, what we conducted there with different substances. It is called the hollow mask experiment, and it is a kind of a monitor with two pictures and a stereoscope so that you will have a kind of three-dimensional perception if you look through that stereoscope. And the hollow masks are prepared in a way, do you know if that is a hollow mask or not? I cognitively biased you by telling you it could be possibly a hollow mask. But it's not so easy to decide. Usually, if you don't have the concept of the hollow mask, you will always tell, no, it's the usual face. Right? Because your perception is over your preconcepts of the situation. You have seen hundreds of millions of usual faces, right? But not a hollow mask, not one time. And so usually your perceptual impression will be overridden by your preconceptions. Pretty interesting. So schizophrenics, for example, they see the hollow mask. Who is more realistic? You or them. However, if you have a night of sleep loss, you see much more of the hollow masks. If you do cannabis, you see much more. If you do psilocybin, you see much more. If you do ketamine, you see them as usual. So, however, who knows what these experiments mean. And we have conducted also some qualitative studies on what happens to patients if they were given MDMA and LSD in a therapeutic context, but we have conducted these studies on patients which were treated under similar and identical conditions for years in underground therapeutic work. It also appeared with maps named Healing with Entactogens in 2012. This book about the qualitative studies. So now I'm coming to a kind of overview about the locations where this research was happening. And I already told you in Freiburg, Tübingen, later on Aachen, where this comparative study was done. I don't want to go into details, but interestingly, they have done a very comprehensive evaluation of pharmacokinetics and metabolism of MDA during these experiments, and the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, as well as with psilocybin. So there is nothing new about that in that sense. They have done that very comprehensively at that point of time. Then there was a comparative study, and the last project of their group, not much known, was to use SMDE. So one of the mirroring versions you have of an organic molecule in a liquid solution. And so it's usually more specific on receptors. And so what they found is, in an fMRT study, that the entactogenic effect was still there, but all the side effects were gone. So that may be one of the more interesting candidates in the future. And they also compared DMT and ketamine in another study. Okay, Zurich, I've already mentioned Adolf Dittrich and his research, and also the PET studies of Vollenweider. They have done a lot on the physiology of MDMA as well as on psilocybin, with PET and kinetics of different dosages. And also they have done very interesting research which is proceeding now at Basel University with Matthias Lichty. So they systematically blocked some of the receptors in the brain with known receptor blockers and looked what is left in respect to the effects of these psychedelic drugs. And they also were looking out for neurocognitive measures as well as personality predispositions, means what kind of peer experience will you most probably have if you are that kind of personality. They did find out about this. We know about the Johns Hopkins research. I don't want to go into details anymore here. But more interesting is Charleston, where Michael Mithoefer is conducting his MDMA therapy studies in his own office with PTSD patients. He's also right now conducting a study with MDMA psychotherapy in veterans. Owen has done in Solothurn in his own office MDMA psychotherapy and PTSD. Gasser also in his own office, but as an official clinical trial, that LSD study. And right now, which is pretty interesting because the Swiss government is very reasonable, so they gave them permission to use it in compassionate use. In fact, they have to write 1 page about the patient today, and they will get permission to treat it. But these are only these two, Peter Oehn and Gasser, have this kind of permit. And Peter Gasser will conduct a new study beginning this year about the terminal patients. And Barcelona, Buso started with an interesting project using, very early in the 90s even, using MDMA and PTSD. That project was stopped because of bad publicity and anxious regulators in the university. And Jordi Riba started his project with ayahuasca pharmacokinetics at first, and all the imaging and EEG studies, long-term effects, meanwhile, are researched on. Salvia divinorum was researched, and the other group of Faré and De La Torre has conducted a lot of MDMA pharmacokinetics, repeated dosing, and so on, and also some pharmacodynamic studies. So the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, with Charlie Grove on MDMA psychophysiology, psilocybin in cancer patients, MDMA in autism right now, so there is a kind of tradition going on. And also worth mentioning Mendelssohn and Bagot in San Francisco Medical Center, where they have conducted studies with MDA, LSD, and MDMA, psychophysiological studies mainly, and some pharmacokinetics were done and pharmacodynamics too. And in the 2000, also started by Harriet DeWitt in Chicago, some MDMA research mainly on its pro-social effects. So in London, we have already heard about that. I will not give more information about that. And just left is some information on two very unusual organizations which have to be mentioned, and usually they are not mentioned because they don't send referees anymore, presenters anymore. So this was Aruba, as already mentioned. Since the late 60s, it was a kind of nucleus of the therapeutic networks, underground network, and there was no formal organization, but and it was invisible. They met regularly at Esalen in California, and they have given a lot of support to MDMA therapy, but they dissolved in the late 80s. So then there was a European College for the Study of Consciousness, founded by Leuner, Dittrich, Hofmann, and Schlichting. It was a strictly scientific organization, so you have to have academic credentials and other witnesses which may give you a reputation to be a member of this strictly organized organization, because in the late 80s they were always anxious that they may get suspicious esotericism and so on. And they were mainly interested in altered states of consciousness as well as psychoactive substances. It was very big throughout the 90s in Germany and on an international scale also. They held 3 international conferences and some symposia. And what is really worth mentioning is they had a very broad scope of aspects: history, anthropology, philosophy, religion, spirituality, chemistry, pharmacology, neurophysiology, music, art, consciousness, psychopathology, therapy, and more. They really were very comprehensive. They had used theoretical and empirical approaches in their research, and more than 200 scientific papers came out of that organization. And it very much influenced society and science in Germany, especially. Okay, then there is one slide about the SAEPT again, the Swiss Physicans Society for Psycholytic Therapy, founded by Peter Baumann, who started an initiative in the beginning of the 80s, asking 300 Swiss psychiatrists by mail to give their answers if they are interested in this kind of conducting this kind of therapy or not. And they came back to him with a lot of interest. And so also MDMA came along and triggered the whole thing a lot, because it was free at that point of time to take it. And they got special permits, I already mentioned that, and held 3 symposia up to now and regular workshops. So this institution is still active, and they also were involved in the MDMA and LSD studies, high-ranking studies conducted in Switzerland. And so this is my synopsis right now, 2 slides of that. So, oh no, it's a little more because there are 2 pictures. So if you look at the therapeutic research, I have compiled a very thorough bibliography of all the early therapeutic research, and this is the statistics of that. And as you can see, it started in the mid-50s. I don't know, that thing works not, all right? Okay, so it started in the mid-50s, and then you had this peak here in the early 60s without any recreational use at that time, and then there was another peak at the end of the 60s when the researchers tried to prove that that is safe, and there were 2 big surveys on their patients, which were counting in the 10,000s, and it was found there's no more risks than with conventional psychotherapy. And so, but the research declined and we're going down. And here you can see in 1984, you see the perfect Reagan effect when no publication was done in that year. The only year there was no publication. That was Ronald Reagan on his highs. Okay, so, and then, but what you also can see is that it was never gone, right? And so if we look at the whole spectrum of psychedelic research over all these decades, we will see that it started in the early 20th century, but it was very much triggered in the mid-50s by the serotonin or neurotransmitter research in the psychiatric community, because they got hold of the biology of mental illness, as well as in therapeutic applications. And then I couldn't give you the peak, right? And so, but in the late 60s, it was and come down, and in the beginning of the 70s, virtually nothing was published until the late 80s, when some research was going on. Then the ECBS and the SAEPT and these organizations were more active, and then it was going down again shortly in the 2000s, and now it's on the decline, on the increase again. Okay, so my last slides are about antidepressants. So we have heard this word and this term of drugs without any questioning and without any critique. There was a lot of criticism during the last 10 years about the efficacy of antidepressants, and I only will give you one slide from one critical review, which was published on a very potent journal, and it shows you that the effective the low line will give you the scores of a depression measuring scale, right? So if you have a light depression and a medium range depression, you will not profit from antidepressants more than from placebo. So why did the people believe in that for so long? It was because the research is completely biased. It was a case that the pharmaceutical industry conducted, for example, to establish an SSRI, they conducted 10 studies, and they figured out 8 showed no effect, so they only published the 2 which have shown an effect, by chance, in a way. You know, and so this research was and the studies were very much manipulated, and so therefore they have shown some clinical improvement, but not much even then. But this is a statistics of what the FDA, when they found out about the suicides related to SSRI, they were really critical, and they pressed the pharmaceutical companies to give all the data. And if you analyze all the data, it's kind of placebo-like, the effect. And so don't believe in serotonin and depression. There's even no proof of that. Even one presenter has presented data that there is a certain deficit in serotonin 2A receptor. That's not true. That's not true. Simply, I've read the last reviews. That's not true. And so you have to be really skeptical. But my point is the following. So the era of psychopharmacology started in the 1950s. Okay? So we had a few medications going on in the 40s. They had only tranquilizers before the era of psychopharmacology started. Then in the 1950s, you can see that over there, they got a hold of the so-called antidepressants, right? They also found out about the neuroleptic substances, so the antipsychotic medications, and they also found out about the anxiolytics, mainly benzodiazepines like Valium or diazepam, right? And in the 1960s, look over there on the left side, the hallucinogens were on the market and in research. They were kind of on the same level to be tested as potentially effective medicines to treat mental disorders and neurosis and so on. And there were also the stimulants, right? And now, what we see now is the pharmaceutical industry, in fact, has stopped all research into psychopharmacological agents. I'm not telling a story, that's true. Because they know the corruptness of their data and they have nothing in the pipeline. And so we are in a historical moment in a way because all the research about, in the 1970s, these substances were obsolete, right? So there was nothing going on there. But right now, we see that in the 1990s, in the 80s, nothing happened. In the 2000s, everybody believed in all these substances, but right now, the research declined completely in respect to all these substances. So psychopharmacology, what should they do if they get even the university departments, they don't get financed by the pharmaceutical industry for doing this kind of conventional psychopharmacological studies? So we are kind of lost. We still have these medications, suspicious as they are in a lot of respects, but right now we are showing up with the hallucinogenic drugs again, right? And also with a kind of stimulants, the entectogens. Right? So it may be a special historical moment where we are that research may really go on and lead to something because there's no alternative left in a way, right? Okay, what are my theoretical conclusions? So there are waves of research. Some people would think about a tidal pattern. I don't know what will happen if David Nutt is retired. Who knows? But what we also can see from an historical point of view is psychopharmacology's preference for repressants. So we have anxiolytic drugs, MDMA, but they use these repressive anxiolytic drugs like Valium. So we change the pattern of the anxiolytic drugs. And also interesting is they were always searching for receptor-specific drugs, and called our drugs dirty drugs because they work on a lot of receptors in different fashions, But interestingly, these dirty drugs miraculously changed into something what they call now pharmacologically rich. And what is the difference is you are trying to target one symptom with these conventional psychopharmacological approaches. But what these drugs, what we have in hand, do is they induce a therapeutically useful brain matrix. So the whole state, the whole configuration of the brain will be altered by them, temporarily. So it's not dangerous. So you're not doing something chronic to the organism, poisoning it or something with an SRI or related drugs. Yeah. And what the consequence is, we have to combine research into psychotherapy and drugs, combining these two approaches. This will be the future. And in the 60s, they haven't conducted these appropriate studies because from a methodological point of view, they were overwhelmed. They couldn't handle this so easily because it's really a complex matter. Okay, so we have to be holistic, as we have heard today, versus decontextualizing these drugs and only looking for an interaction with one receptor. It's a holistic treatment approach where you have to look at the process of the treatment and the context of the treatment too, right? It has to be included. Because reductionistic psychopharmacology focusing on these simple receptor interactions will fail at last. And I personally think that psychotherapy promoting drugs are the future for a lot of mental diseases and their treatment, right? So, and what we see in the historical fate is that we have basic research leading to therapeutic studies meanwhile, and even drug development, thanks to Heffter, a non-profit organization, and MAPS, another non-profit organization. And there is a hopeful future for a more scientific and objective evaluation of these substances. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Torsten. Is this on? Thank you very much, Torsten, for this elegant and eloquent presentation, this historical overview of psychedelics research. I think we can take a couple of questions before we'll wrap it up. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the interesting lecture. You mentioned...
Huh? You want to take that? Later on.
You mentioned the prominent psychedelic researcher Sidney Cohen, and I'm under the impression that towards the end of the 60s he turned sort of negative towards psychedelic research. Is there something you would like to say about that? Is there perhaps something we could learn from that, or anything other?
Yeah, so there are a few kind of lessons. I only can give some ideas. So one is, don't let it leak out of the therapeutic framework. That led to some problems. The other thing is, if it is much more based and settled in science, what we will do in respect to therapeutic work, it would be better. Especially, I wouldn't prefer to give people licenses to do it in their offices. I really don't recommend that. This may lead to problems. It's not necessary that it will lead to problems with very competent therapists, but I think it's better if we embed it in a clinical setting with a team of workers. I think that's the best. There is some social control around, and also supervision and exchange about the people's experiences, and also some kind of safety background. You know, I would prefer very much that, and I think all the clinical researchers would agree with that model.
Thank you for your speech. I have a question. I think that everybody in the room knows a little bit of psychedelics and what it does, and we see it the whole conference. But there are a lot of people outside of this room, like psychiatrists, people that are not knowing of this research. So how could we change their view on this? Yeah. And if you would say it in like 5 sentences so that I could take that with me and then spread it. Because I really think that if you look at like people that had psychosis or schizophrenic or depression, etc., your frame of reference is way different than the one sitting in front of you treating you.
So one feature of these drugs is they can have positive effects. That's proven in a very safe or secure fashion meanwhile. That's one point. The other is they will be contextualized in a systematic fashion in therapeutic work with manuals and these clinical kind of settings. And also the other drugs lost in a lot of respects. Neuroleptics, in fact, damage the brain. This is what they found out recently. I mean, so, you know, we still have to use them, but we have to be much more critical. And so let's change the critical attitude against these drugs, or push it against them, and allow a more critical and objective evaluation of the other substances. And also is that we combine, this is very important, combine psychotherapy, a very effective method to treat a lot of people with mental illnesses. We combine an already effective and established model with some drugs to be given a few times. And I think there's nothing bad about that. And if that is effective, it's even having less side effects in the long range, for sure. And it's making psychotherapy more effective and even more available to a lot of people which are maybe under usual treatment conditions can't be helped as much because they have so grave traumas or diseases. That's it.
Thank you, Torsten. I just wondered why you so briefly skimmed over the work done at Imperial and Bristol and Cardiff in the last 6 or 7 years, because those are multimodal imaging studies done with fMRI and MEG in the same cohort of people, have been the most comprehensive studies of LSD and psilocybin that have ever been done. But you skirted over it so quickly, and I wonder whether you object to the validity of those results.
Then I didn't want to minimize anything. It's only the case I have shown the slide, but I skipped it over because we have already heard so much about it. So I don't want to repeat everything, but I don't want to leave it out, right? So I already left out some stuff, for sure.
Thank you.
So forgive me for that. So sorry.
Thanks, Torsten. I was struck by your comment about the shift in representation of these substances from dirty drugs to pharmacologically rich drugs. And I'm wondering about the historical research of combinations of substances. I believe Salvador Roquet would sometimes use various drugs in combination simultaneously. I'm wondering if you can comment on past research that looked at combinations and the potential for future research where these combinations may be used.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. People combine drugs anyway, but from a pharmacological or also psychotherapeutical pharmacological standpoint, I wouldn't recommend that. For example, a combination which is often used also in therapy is the combination of MDMA and LSD, but our data sets, what we have generated in these therapeutic sessions, is showing that you only dump down the LSD effect by using MDMA in parallel. A lot of the LSD effect will go down. The subjective effects, I mean. And so it's not really worth it. And also you may add risks. And what another problem of even conventional pharmacology is the so-called clinical pharmacology. So we do research a lot on every kind of substance we want to give into the human organism to alter some functioning, even hypertension and all that. But we are not doing research with combinations. And so all the old people which get 10 medications, you don't know what happened there. There's no research on that. There's virtually no research on that. And that's a really relevant problem because a lot, even in the 10,000s of people are dying from these interactions which we don't know about. And so I wouldn't recommend it as much, but in respect to DMT and Harmaline, we have a combination, you know, and there was also a combination done of MDMA and 2CB taken later on. This was also recognized as a worthwhile combination, but I don't think it is really necessary. This is my point of view.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, one.
Thank you for the historical overview. Very interesting. I'm a psychiatry resident in the US, so I may be coming at this from a slightly biased perspective. But it was a little tough to hear kind of the sweeping discounting of psychotropic drugs that we use for depression, schizophrenia, et cetera. And I agree with you completely that there are huge gaps in our evidence base and they're being used not judiciously all the time. But I wonder if we can't just we're here at a scientific conference and we kind of let the research speak for itself in many ways. And I know it's more than that with these compounds. But can't we just let the drugs speak for themselves and get to trials where we pit MDMA against SSRIs for PTSD and just, you know, let it show for itself that it's better rather than kind of have to wage a war against that whole thing and you know, be part of an anti-psychiatric movement in a sense.
Yeah, but isn't it the case that a lot of studies were done in this way? I mean, for example, Rick has some data sets in his presentations about the effectiveness of SSRIs, which are kind of not really effective in PTSD, especially if it is a severe PTSD. And if you compare that to a psychotherapy, embedded MDMA psychotherapy, then you have much larger effects, even in so-called treatment-resistant patients. You know, a lot of the approval of psychopharmacological medications is done because of very tiny differences. If you compare, for example, there was a study by Joanna Moncrieff published in a potent journal comparing the studies which were done in the 1960s where they have done more objective research in that sense that they used not only the active medication and the glucose placebo doing nothing, they used the active placebos which give you some symptoms too. But no antidepressant or so-called antidepressant effect. But what you see there is they're up on the level where the antidepressants are working.
Right.
So if they would have used active placebos in these studies, there was no effect.
I realize there are a lot of conflicting evidence, but I mean, we have large-scale trials like the CATIE trial, the STAR-D trial, STEP-BD for all of the domains of, you know, chronic mental illness. And I don't know, I just think it's a little bit more nuanced, I guess.
Sorry if I'm
overall.
saying such things which some people may find problematic. But I am based on science and good meta-analysis and so on. So, okay.
All right, thank you very much, Torsten, for sharing your encyclopedic knowledge on psychedelics.